Hello and welcome to the Physiology of Endurance Running podcast. I'm Owain and joined as always by Dan. How's it going, Dan?
Yeah, good, thanks. Ready for another deep dive into physiology?
Yeah. So we're back with what we call normal episode. And we're going to look at really how to improve your thresholds. So building on our last sort of main episode of how to improve your VO2 max, we thought we would then tackle the next sort of main determinant of endurance performance, which is your thresholds. We've done a few podcasts on thresholds in the last 6 months, and maybe within those have inferred on ways to train these, and then with Dan's Road to Valencia series sort of inferred the same. But yeah, we thought we'd do a bit of a dive into the literature about thresholds. Just before we
haven't done a
start,
dedicated episode on thresholds, have we? I don't think.
Yeah.
I don't think so. I think we'll hopefully do a bigger, deeper dive.
Yeah.
But before we get to that, we were delighted, but our podcast is being sponsored by Saw for the next couple of months. And if you haven't come across Saw running kit, it is really high-end running apparel. Super nice stuff. So I wore their shorts for Valencia Marathon. Fantastic because they're really comfy, but also you can store so many gels in them. Like you can get a good 6 gels in there easily. So 40-gram gels. I carried them around, very comfortably without any issue in the split shorts. Their marathon half tights also really good. You've got a pair of them, right, Owain?
Yep. Yeah, loads of gels can be stuffed in those as well. I think I put 4 like 40-gram gels in the other day, and barely noticed them. So
yeah,
perfect.
So go and check them out. Really nice warm weather stuff, really nice winter stuff, but also like great race vests as well. And yeah, clubs you can get your club vests done through Saw, and they are so much nicer than anything I've ever raced in before. So yeah, go and check them out. Nice. So should we start talking about thresholds?
Yes. Yeah, let's dive in.
For me, the starting point was actually we need to define what thresholds, what are thresholds?
Yeah.
Do you want to kick us off?
Well, it's a bit of a
throw you under the bus, yeah.
Yeah, literally thrown under the bus. I mean, I'd say probably part of the problem is that there isn't a scientific consensus on thresholds. I think I've seen I think it's maybe a Mark Burnley paper that quoted like 27 different thresholds. There is a lot of different definitions of thresholds. I think we commonly refer to lactate threshold and lactate turn point, or first threshold, second threshold.
LT1, LT2.
We're using different terms. You've got maximal metabolic steady state, maximal lactate steady state. They're all sort of the same thing, but what I guess they are is I guess clear. No, the thing is they're not even clear, but they're sort of clear boundaries in terms of physiological response to a specific amount of or specific intensity of work. At the same time, I'm sure something we're going to mention is that it's not like a really clear, completely different response, one side or the other of these thresholds. It is fairly like blurred and nuanced. But yeah, they're sort of the main anchor points we can use along with VO2 max to determine sort of what work rate you're working at. The common one that, like I said, that we refer to and I think a lot of people use now is lactate thresholds, because you're able to measure lactate quite easily, and then that can be anchored to a heart rate. Could be anchored to a pace as well, but that's not maybe as accurate. But yeah, so there's essentially there's a difference in metabolic response at different work rates that you can then see from the accumulation of lactate in blood. But I'm sure we're going to talk about it. There's a number of different things that impact that, which mean you can't draw really clear definitions. Yeah, I think I sort of answered it, but maybe made it a bit more messy. But that's also sort of the world we live in, right? Like it's really not clear. And I think anyone that says, "Oh, really, like there's really clear black and white things," is wrong, or is maybe misguided. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're right. People get too hung up on yeah. I think if anyone's got too much confidence in anything, then without having any leeway in their viewpoints, then they're probably either misguided themselves, or they're just trying to sell you something. Like, this is the perfect way of doing it, isn't it?
Oh, like the bloody what is it, the continuous lactate monitors, like.
We'll see. Yeah. Or just, just trying to make them sound more clever than they are, maybe. I don't know. But yeah, basically the idea of thresholds are that if you're depending on if you're above, below, between the thresholds, you should see distinct physiological responses. So you've got and I don't think people always are aware that there are two thresholds. There's an LT1, a first lactate threshold, where actually up to that point of exercise intensity, lactate just remains at your sort of baseline resting levels. And then, so that point where the highest intensity where lactate remains stable is what you typically refer to as your LT1, your lactate threshold, aerobic threshold, like ventilatory threshold 1. Like, there's loads of different names for it, but they're all just really trying to estimate the same point. Then if you increase the intensity a bit more, lactate levels start to go up, but only gradually. And importantly, if you fixed the intensity there and just held someone running at this intensity for an hour, lactate would be elevated above their baseline, but it would be stable over time. And if we keep rising that intensity a bit more, then there'll be a point where it's the highest intensity someone can run at without lactate levels building up in the blood. So it'll be elevated, but they'll be stable. So, this is what typically people call this is what people typically refer to when they say threshold. So their LT2, their lactate turn point, the highest speed they can sustain without lactate accumulating in the blood. So if we had, say it was 18k an hour, that was their LT2. If we ran them at it for 5 minutes, their lactate might be 3. Another 5 minutes, it's 3. Another 10 minutes, it's 3. It's not really drifting up very much. If you go slightly above that, so 18.5k an hour, then it might be 4 after 5 minutes, 6 after 10 minutes, and actually within another 10-15 minutes is getting really, really hard, and you're pretty much at VO2 max. Things are just drifting upwards. So it's about highest speed you can run at without lactate accumulating in the blood, but also there's loads of different markers you could look at. You could look at just oxygen consumption. Is that stable, or is that drifting up? You could look at how much CO2 they were producing. Is that stable, or is that drifting up? You could look at like blood pH, muscle pH. There's loads of different things, but I guess that's the idea, is we can use lactate to get a good idea of what's going on within the body. It's not just looking at one specific molecule. It's just indicative of all the other changes that are happening.
Yeah. I mean, you hinted at two things there, where you mentioned like ventilatory thresholds. They're fairly similar to lactate thresholds, but they're hardest to measure because you basically need to be in a lab to measure those.
And they're less precise as well.
Yeah.
But you can get a good idea. People use them because they're easier. In some ways, they're easier to measure, but you can just do it from a VO2 max test, which is more efficient, which is quicker, like more time efficient. But yeah, they're not as good. Maybe that's just my opinion, but they're not.
And then I guess when you map the data out, like lactate thresholds are sort of easier to see. I guess like ventilatory thresholds require, I think, a bit more knowledge and sort of being happy with playing around with like a data set. Yeah. And then the other thing you mentioned there was, where you were talking about your sort of 18 kilometer an hour and 18.5 kilometer an hour example, that you can test that. That's maximal lactate steady state testing, which is the gold standard for finding your second threshold or your turn point, which I guess you've probably done a few of those tests with triathlon and triathletes, maybe.
Not really,
not
to be
many.
honest.
Like,
I guess
the
closest I've got to doing it is just when I'm monitoring a session in the lab, and I'm doing 5 times 10 minutes, 6 by 10 minutes, and I want my lactate levels to be stable.
Yeah. But that's the gold standard method, and it barely gets used, which is maybe another I don't know, problem or thing to consider with thresholds is that we don't actually use the gold standard method to measure them, because it's really hard with running. It's a lot easier in cycling, which is why I mentioned triathlon, and I've seen it done in a study with cyclists, because you can just have a cyclist sat there on the turbo and they can come back day after day and do the same thing. Whereas if you got someone to come in and run on Monday at sort of 17.5 kilometers an hour for half an hour, and then Tuesday at 18 kilometers an hour, and then Wednesday at 18.5, and then Thursday at 19, like that would be a massive week. Like you couldn't really do that. Whereas with cycling, you are able to do that, and you can sort of continuously sample when you're.
Still be pretty hard though, wouldn't it? I don't think you'd get many elite cyclists coming in to do that, would you?
Like it's probably, a once or twice a year thing, but so that's maybe another sort of thing to consider with thresholds, is that there is a gold standard that doesn't get used much.
We always infer it from the lactate response to a range of different speeds, pretty much. Like that's what you do. You do a progressive test where you do 5-minute stages or whatever. Typically, I use 5 minutes, but looking at response to 5, 6, 7, 8 different speeds, seeing what the lactate curve it produces, and when the LT1, that first lactate threshold, is pretty easy to identify. It's that first rise in lactate. So when it's gone up above your resting levels, right, that's your LT1. The second one, it's just where you see a bit of a break point. So lactate will go up slowly, and then actually you increase the speed by 1k an hour, and you get quite a big jump in lactate. Well, that's a sign that if you kept running them at that latter stage, that speed, it's not going to be sustainable anymore. You're going to see a big accumulation of lactate quite quickly, and you can effectively just draw a straight line between those two points and see where I estimate where your maximal lactate steady state is. And I do think that's a good way of doing it, a robust way of doing it, and it's certainly repeatable and good for tracking trends over time. But you can't have precision to go your LT2 is 18.2 kilometers an hour. And not, I think you can be close to a couple of points of a K, but you can't, I don't think you can say, right, it's 18.1 and not 18.0 or 18.2. Like that's outside of the what am I trying to say, measurement effect, range of the test.
Yeah, because there's always a biological variation in these measurements, exactly. Right? And there's something we'll maybe come on to when we talk about some of the research, that like percentage differences can just be explained by biological variation. I know, like one of the papers I looked at was like 2% difference, and it's like, well, that's measurement.
Is that
error.
Real? Yeah. If you tested someone, if you tested someone 3 times in a week, then you'd expect a 2% variation between those tests, wouldn't you? So you can't be confident that's a true improvement in performance, or actually it's just random variation.
And then I think maybe the last thing I sort of had noted down with defining thresholds is different athletes will present a different, if we're talking about lactate thresholds, will present a different profile, right? So like someone, I know we've seen tests from people where they're maybe more 400-800 runners, where they've got a lot of, where something we'll come on to, a lot of fast twitch fibers, and their lactate is just high to start with, right? And then it just keeps going up and up. Whereas like if you look at like one of your tests, and especially if you start at the speed you would start if you were just going into a lab and just getting tested without some of your background information. So if you started your test at like 14k an hour, you would just see flat, really low lactates, and then it would go up a little bit and then a little bit more, but it probably wouldn't go sky high. And that's, a lot of that could be explained by fiber type composition within the muscle, and then again we're going to come on to mitochondrial differences or development differences. So it's not that like it's absolutely not a there's not a one sort of response. And then when you talk about people that just don't train at all, I know you sort of said this to me before, there's not really like 2 thresholds, there's just one. It's just
lactate's lactate's low or it's just going up basically. Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to make. And one of the flaws if people that make with let me start that again. One of the flaws people make with monitoring their own lactate in training is they get too hung up on the absolute lactate value, like 2 millimole and 4 millimole. That's what people talk about, 2 and 4 millimole. And that, that first threshold is about 2 millimole, and that second threshold is about 4 millimole. And yeah, on average, it probably is about 2 and 4 millimole. But I know I've tested triathletes who can't get their lactate to 4 millimole, but their baseline is 0.5. So it'll be 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, and then it might go 1, 1.5, 2, and then it will go to 3.5. So their second threshold is more like 2 millimole. But also, I've also tested the distance athletes who, like you said, are the complete opposite. They can, if they were going to do a 400 meters flat out, they might produce 20 millimole of lactate. So their baseline might be 2.5 millimole, and that point so it might go 2.5, 2.5, 2.5, then it will go 3.5, 4.5, 5.5, 6.5, and then it will go 8. So their actual LT2 is more like 6.5 millimole. So don't get too caught up about. You need to look at the shape of the curve, is what I'm trying to say, and not just take absolute values.
Yeah. In the same way, I think most people now realize you can't just take like generalized like heart rate numbers and say, oh, I need to be below this. Like it's very, very individual. And yeah, the same with lactate. And you definitely see a lot of like people just going off 2 and 4, don't you? Yeah, and that's partly again, that's researchers' fault, because 2 and 4 gets used in research a lot.
Yeah. And it's easy, isn't it? It's just to go right. What is the speed at 2 millimole? What's the speed at 4 millimole? That's very easy to do, and it's less. And in some ways, it's less risk of bias, because you can't argue with that. So in some ways, sometimes it is a good thing to use. But for monitoring progress over time, that's not a bad way of doing it. But for prescribing training, it's a poor way of doing it, I would say.
Yeah. So to be honest, I'm not sure if I think people hopefully understand the idea around thresholds, but also that there's a lot of grey area and a lot more to understand around them. But yeah, hopefully that sets a bit of a foundation.
Hopefully, you got an idea of what they are. But I guess what we need to talk about next is why are they important for performance? And we talked about VO2 max in our last main episode, and that sort of sets the ceiling for aerobic metabolism. So if we work someone as hard as they can, how much oxygen can they use, which is a proxy really for how much energy can they generate aerobically. But that's not sustainable for that long, and that's because of all of that. If you're working at that intensity, you're producing loads of hydrogen ions, you're producing lots of other waste products that are going to cause fatigue. So as soon as you go past that LT2, that's effectively a speed that's not that sustainable anymore. You're going to experience that drift, and like we said, lactate is going to start accumulating, which lactate in itself isn't bad, but it's the hydrogen ions associated with it which are going to start causing your muscles to fatigue, decrease their contractility, and effectively just make exercise not sustainable anymore. So the thresholds determine what percentage of that VO2 max you're going to be able to sustain during a race. For the longer distances. For the shorter distances, thresholds are still really important, and I think people don't understand this necessarily. But because if you think about a 1500 meter race think about a 1500 meter race, you're operating above your VO2 max intensity. You're going to be at VO2 max quite quickly. But the further you are above your threshold, the more waste products you're going to produce, the quicker you're going to fatigue. So if your threshold is closer to your 1500 meter race pace than someone else, then actually you're going to have produced less fatigue byproducts going into the last lap than the other athlete. And so that you're going to be able to then produce more of a kick at the end and just be able to, or just hold a higher average pace. So it is still important. And we see that with the likes of Jakob Ingebrigtsen, who can run world-class times over 1500 meters, world record for 3K. I probably could break the world record for 5K, and it's gone very good 10K. But a Jake Whiteman, who's probably not as good thresholds, he can't do that because his thresholds aren't as good. Maybe his VO2 max is just as good, but he can't sustain those speeds as well.
I think just something you said there as well in terms of the metabolic response once you're over your second threshold. When we're measuring lactate, and whether it's in the lab or whether it's someone with like a lactate pro out on the track, you're using lactate as a sort of inference of what's going on in the muscle. Like lactate is a byproduct of metabolism, right? It's always produced. Some of it's used as a fuel, but it's an inference of all of those other things that are happening. So again, sort of maybe a myth is like the lactate is bad, and it's not, but it's what we can measure. I'm sure if there was an easy way to measure hydrogen ions in your blood, like you could measure that, and that would be a more accurate measure of the sort of maybe bad thing in your blood that's causing a loss of performance, right? But lactates, I think one of a really good sort of definition of it I heard was like years ago, it was Ross Tucker saying that lactates, like if you're walking through a minefield and all the mines have a little red flag on top of them, lactate's the little red flag, it's not the mine. So if you step on a mine, it's not the lactate that blows you up, it's the hydrogen ions and everything else, right?
Yeah.
And you can see the lactate when you measure it, so that's what you're measuring, but it's not the thing that actually is doing the damage, so to speak.
I like that. Yeah. And I guess the other caveat is we're measuring lactate in the blood, but what would be better to look at is lactate levels or acidity within the muscle. But to do that, you have to do a biopsy, and we're not going to be going around doing biopsies on an athlete during a training session. But luckily they've done plenty enough studies to correlate what's going on in the muscle with what's going on in the blood, and it's pretty tightly correlated. So you can do blood pH quite easily, but the problem with that is pH is still really tightly regulated, and also the acidity in the blood isn't what's important, it's the acidity in the muscle, and you can't, and we're buffering that pH all the time with the likes of our just natural bicarb system we have, so you don't see the ranges you see in compared to lactate, which can go from 0.5 millimole up to over 25 millimole in certain athletes, whereas pH is going to be with 7 plus or minus 0.1. That's hard to actually infer changes from that. It's going to be very stable, even if you're doing, you've just finished a 400-meter race, your pH isn't going to drop very much.
It causes you a lot of issues.
Although you produce loads of hydrogen ions, it's not going to produce, because your body's going to defend against that. But it doesn't matter if the lactate levels get that high. Lactate's actually safe, it's fine. So we don't need to buffer that, which is why it's better to measure lactate than pH. But yeah, it's really important for performance, basically, regardless of what event you're training for. So it's definitely a worthwhile thing trying to improve. And it's one of the big three determinants of performance. You got your VO2 max, your thresholds, and your economy. I think that's the other thing I wanted to say, was that we typically talk about thresholds in terms of speed, but actually we shouldn't, strictly speaking, we shouldn't do that, because the speed at your threshold is a factor of both how good is your threshold and your economy. So really we should talk about thresholds as like either just what's the oxygen consumption at your threshold, or what is your percentage of VO2 max at your threshold. That's a better indicator of where your threshold sits rather than the speed, because if you think about your VO2 max, when you got your threshold, say that's at 90% of your VO2 max, then actually it's the economy then that's going to translate that into speed. So you could actually have someone with quite high speeds at their threshold, but their threshold might be quite poor in terms of where it sits relative to their VO2 max, but just compensating with really good economy. Hopefully that makes sense. Probably a minor point, but I think people don't understand that necessarily. So how do we train it? That's the next big question. That's why we're all here. How do you improve your thresholds?
And I think the first note I made on this was that I think it's worth saying at least I think there's a difference between like threshold training in terms of like, you now hear about like lactate guided threshold interval training, I think is what it got called in that paper, right? And training targeting your thresholds. I think there's a difference. So like the Ingebrigtsens is the best example, are doing threshold training to accumulate loads of work. And they're actually, if we're, you just said don't use speeds, but they are actually running faster than what would maybe be their their pace at their thresholds, but they're doing it in such a way that keeps the metabolic response below their thresholds. But part of the reason they're doing that is to accumulate running above it. So I just thought, I think it's worth pointing out that, at least in my mind, they're slightly different things. Yeah, that was sort of my first thought. And then I think also it's worth maybe mentioning as well that it's something that comes up a lot in our podcasts, that there's possibly a bit of a sort of specificity trap with endurance training and running training. And we mentioned this with the VO2 Max podcast, that, or 5K training, that people train for 5Ks by running at 5K pace, and I'm sure it's going to be something we mentioned, that you don't need to just know your threshold heart rate, for example, and then just train right at it. There's more nuance, and just avoiding that sort of specificity trap is, I'm sure it's somewhere we're going to go with this.
So I think apologies for my, if you were watching the actual video of this, if we put the video out, I just got interrupted by a SOAR package arriving, so I'm very excited to dig into that and see what goodies we've received. But yeah, I completely agree. I think people think that threshold training might improve your threshold, but it's not quite as clear cut as that. And there's definitely a difference between doing that lactate guided threshold training and training to improve your threshold. Because I've the amount of athletes that I've tested, they've done a VO2 max block and their VO2 max has stayed the same, but their thresholds are improved, or they've not done any high intensity at all, like what the training block you've just done, loads of easy running, and their thresholds have got better without doing any work at that pace. And hopefully we'll go into talk through some of the research in the next few minutes that show that there's lots of different ways to improve your threshold. And it's the same as I think it's similar to what the Ingebrigtsens are doing, and they've gone away from, right, we're not going to train at, I think we understand now that you don't need to do loads of work at 1500 meter race pace to run really well over 1500 meters, and it's the same thing. You don't need to do specific stuff at a given intensity to improve your qualities at that intensity. There's lots of different ways of getting fitter. You don't just need to go, right, I'm going to run a marathon, I'm going to do loads of stuff at marathon pace. Obviously, so that's going to be part of your training, but it shouldn't be like every single session shouldn't be at marathon pace. It's just get moving away from specificity.
And well, being specific, but in terms of being specific to your own physiology and your own needs. And again, we hammer this point, but like go get tested and get profiled. Like the best training groups are profiling people and saying, oh, okay, like this person needs this and this person needs this, and it's completely different, and the only way you can find that out is actually getting lab tested. That's the specificity you should be looking at, not specificity in terms of demands of the race of this, so I'm going to train this. I think maybe is first thing to sort of mention when we talk about this.
So I guess moving on to actually, what do we want to, if we want to improve our thresholds, what actually determines our thresholds? Because we've already said there's lots of different ways we could measure it. What does it, we can look at lactate and that's great, but what are we trying to change physiologically through training to improve our thresholds? And with the VO2 max episode we said that the main thing you're trying to change are those central adaptations, and by that I mean the size and strength of the left ventricle of the heart, so you can pump more blood around the system at a greater rate, deliver more oxygen to your muscles. So it's very, VO2 max is very much a central adaptations you're trying to achieve. Whereas for the thresholds, it's much more about the peripheral adaptations. So by peripheral, I mean stuff going on within the muscle. And by that more specifically, I mean the mitochondria. That's what we're trying to change. We're trying to have more mitochondria and make them more efficient, more effective at utilizing oxygen and producing energy aerobically.
Yeah. And I guess then we're going to talk about how you'd actually improve those. I guess this is where it's harder to measure. Like, how do you measure a change in mitochondrial density and function? Generally, it's things like biopsies, right? Like,
exactly. That's where there's a difference between what we do as like applied practitioners trying to make athletes faster and where the research goes. So we use lactate because it's a really nice surrogate marker of mitochondrial density, mitochondrial volume, mitochondrial efficiency. We don't do muscle biopsies on athletes because actually that's not you wouldn't be doing that regularly. No elite athlete's going to come and volunteer for muscle biopsy. And there are just better ways of quantifying those thresholds, those adaptations, which are looking at lactate. But effectively, the more mitochondria we have, the better the aerobic capacity within the muscle, the better the more sustainable our energy production can be. Like, we used to think that, we're producing loads of lactate because the muscle isn't getting enough oxygen, and that's not the case. It's the fact that actually we can't produce enough energy aerobically to meet the demands, and so you need to rely more on your glycolysis, more on your anaerobic energy pathways to keep moving or keep running at a higher intensity, basically. So the more mitochondria we have, the more we can do without having to produce lactate in the first place.
Yep. So then, talking about sort of research that actually looks at lactate training or improving your thresholds, and maybe the way to say it is actually that there's not loads that looks at this. More a sort of wider maybe issue with sports science research is that it's actually really hard to do training studies that give any sort of clear picture. So you sort of inferred it with talking about how we actually apply it to training. Like, we're with a lot of this training, we're taking hints at what might be being done or what might happening, and then trying to apply it to longer term training. I think we mentioned it on the VO2 Max podcast, that a lot of studies most studies aren't longer than 12 weeks. And a few that I've been sort of looking at for this, like, they're 3 weeks long, and then they're drawing conclusions about how to train from 3 weeks worth of training, which really isn't enough. And in like one of the studies, like, they had people do these hard sessions 3 times a week, and like that's also not, like, no one or not many people are really sort of doing that. So you're taking 9 sessions and then saying this is what we think. But yeah, you sort of have to infer and then look at what is being done by, existing performances and like elite training groups, and sort of work it backwards, which is quite common in sports science, I guess, is what are the best people in the world doing, and then trying to figure out the science behind that rather than dictating how they should do it, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. And one of the things that's interesting is there seems to be multiple people having success at the international level through lots of different training, well, quite variable training programs. There's some consistencies, but there's also differences as well. And I think it's more about actually what's their emphasis between exercise intensity and duration. There's groups that do loads of threshold-based stuff. We've already talked about the Ingebrigtsens, but there are still groups out there doing maybe more traditional type training, and by that I mean probably what they've done in the UK since the 80s, 90s, which is 3 hard sessions a week, way above threshold. Maybe some threshold-based stuff there in the winter as well, but I'm thinking more about those Jake Whitemans, people like Keely Hodgkinson, again, like 800-meter athletes. Maybe there's more of a bias there that you need a bit more intensity, but Jake Whiteman and Jakob Ingebrigtsen have got very similar 1500-meter times, but train very differently. Like Jake's very public in saying that his endurance isn't that great. He does loads of high intensity, and if you race Jakob and Jake over an 800, well, Jake's going to win every time. I'd be pretty confident of that.
That's going to get some responses.
Yeah, maybe we'll see. But what's interesting is if we look at how you can produce more mitochondria, how you can undergo mitochondrial biogenesis, which is that process of producing more mitochondria, you can actually get very similar responses from doing both long duration, low intensity exercise, or by doing short repeated sprints. And the body is very complicated. For both endurance and intensity, having more mitochondria is really good for the same reason we talked about earlier. Doesn't matter if you're above or below your threshold. Having better thresholds is going to be beneficial for performance. And effectively, there's 2 different signaling pathways, but there's one signaling pathway that leads to mitochondrial biogenesis, which is what we call PGC1 alpha, and you can activate PGC1 alpha through doing both high intensity training or low intensity training, just in 2 different ways effectively. And we're not going to go into the details about the pathways there because I'll get it wrong as well. But effectively, you can activate PGC1 alpha, which then stimulates mitochondrial biogenesis through doing low intensity, easy duration stuff, and by doing high intensity, like really high intensity, like sprint interval training, stuff like 4 times 30 seconds flat out, 4 minutes recovery. So really the question is, how do you balance that out? And actually threshold training might be a good way of doing that, because you get some duration and you get some intensity in. There's a really nice review meta-analysis that came out in the summer. Let me just pull it up here, which was by, I'll probably butcher this name, Mollman, 2024. We'll put it in the show notes. And this was a review meta-analysis. They basically got loads of different studies together, looked at pure endurance training, looked at doing high intensity interval training, which is more like VO2 max type intensity stuff, and then looked at sprint interval training. And each of those different training modalities were effective at increasing mitochondrial content, but the time courses differed. And actually, you got a bigger response initially to doing the more high intensity stuff, so sprint interval training and high intensity interval training, but they seem to plateau quite quickly. Whereas the endurance training didn't. So just doing stuff below your LT1, your lactate threshold, your zone 2, whatever you want to call it, and just nice, easy duration, that didn't see as big in a response in the first couple of weeks, but long term potentially led to bigger, sustained increases in mitochondrial content. And there was also a dose response effect where doing 4 days a week of training was better than doing 2 days a week of training, and doing 6 days a week was better than doing 4 days a week. And it didn't seem to plateau off there either. So volume, what the authors conclude from this paper is actually it's more about the training load, which is important. And load is effectively the intensity of exercise times by the duration of the exercise. and that's going to determine actually how much load are you under. So when you're designing your training program to improve your thresholds, you need intensity and you need duration, but it's finding some combination of that together, which is going to allow you to achieve the most training load in a sustainable way. And I think that's where threshold training inadvertently does help your thresholds, in that you can achieve intensity and volume in a sustainable way, which doesn't break you down to long term. You can stack week on week on week, because you're doing hard training, but you're not killing yourself every week. You're probably less likely to get injured, less likely to get ill, more likely to be consistent. And then inadvertently, you end up improving your thresholds. So in my head, it's just a bit of a coincidence really, but threshold training helps your thresholds.
Yeah, and that feels like quite a similar answer to what we gave in terms of improving your VO2 max, right? It's like balance the intensity and the duration so you actually get more. Which is the conclusion we came to. And I mean, like, it's some of the papers I looked at, where they compare again the sprint training versus more longer training. Like, 4x4 minutes, 4x8 minutes tends to come out as better for the sort of measures that you would consider to be related to thresholds. Unfortunately, a lot of the time they use like power or speed at 4 millimole of lactate, which we've obviously said is maybe not the most or the best way of measuring that. But those sessions come out as better for improving that. But then, if you listen to the VO2 max podcast, we talked about 4x4 minutes and 4x8 minutes and also improving your VO2 max. So it sort of, again, comes back to the same thing, right? Of like improving or increasing the amount of training you're doing by balancing the intensity that you're doing. And you sort of mentioned there the sort of point I was making in terms of length of these studies. Like, I think from memory that the paper you're talking about made a nice little sort of graphic that was then all over Twitter, that was showing like early on the sprint training is way better, but like then that line just stops because no one ever does sprint studies that go more than like 6 weeks. And you just see the low intensity training just sort of gradually creeping up, and that just keeps going. But even that cuts off because we don't do long term studies. That's where you have to start to go to sort of case studies and things like that. But
100%. And I think that's the thing. It's, if a physiology is so complicated, if you can say zone 2 is for mitochondria and high intensity is for VO2 max, well, you're wrong, because there's so much overlap. Like you can increase fat oxidation rates by doing sprint interval training. Like, you just can. Like, the research says about all this, this time saving training, doing 4 times 10 seconds, like 3 times flat out 3 times a week. Well, that's all shown you can increase fat oxidation rates by doing that sort of training. But you can't. But there's a limit to how much benefit you can get from that. I think effective training is, like you said, just finding a way to do a lot of work sustainably. Because going back to this review paper here, for mitochondrial content per minute of work, sprint interval training was 2.3 times more effective than high intensity interval training, so more VO2 max type stuff. And likewise, VO2 HIIT training was 3 times more effective per minute than endurance training. But you can't do the same amount of sprint interval training as you can endurance training. Or you can't do the same amount of sprint interval training as high intensity interval training. So there's a finite response you can get from doing that work. You can't do, even if sprint interval training is so much more effective than endurance training, you can't do an hour's worth of sprint interval training. It's just not possible in a day. But you could do 2 hours of easy running in a day. And actually be able to go again the next day. If you tried to do sprint interval training every day, you would you'd be a CrossFitter, wouldn't you? But you'd also be you would not be a good runner. And you don't need science to tell you that. That's just common sense.
So I think unfortunately a lot of the research isn't actually very clear on how to improve your thresholds, is it? Like, it's So yeah, probably again, running more is going to increase your mitochondrial density. It's going to maybe shift your muscle fiber sort of makeup, more towards slow twitch fibers, which is going to improve your thresholds because you're going to have more mitochondria, and you're going to be able to use, use some of the lactate being produced as a fuel, rather than just having to remove it in other sort of waste products. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me it's actually just the research is clear in that you can use lots of different types of exercise intensities to increase your mitochondrial content, which will very likely improve your thresholds. There's a really good correlation between mitochondrial efficiency, mitochondrial function, and the thresholds. And the research is also clear that it seems to be that the load is the most important thing. It's just finding that balance of training that's going to allow you to accumulate a lot of load. Now, how you quantify load is a whole nother podcast and episode, because intensity times duration. Well, how are you measuring intensity? Duration's easy, but how do you measure intensity? And there's loads of different ways of doing that. Like you've got TRIMP scores, you've got
TSS.
TSS. Yeah. You've got what's the other one? Bannister's TRIMP, isn't there? And they're all flawed, but that's sort of the direction you need to go in, and that you don't need to measure these things. I don't look at these things at all. I don't measure these things at all, but I am thinking about how can I achieve a lot of work basically in a sustainable way. And I also think that some people are going to do better from doing more on high intensity, and some are going to do better from more just endurance training, probably to do with their muscle fiber types, because it depends how complicated you want to go here. You're not using all of your muscle at once. When you're doing easy stuff, you're just using your slow twitches fibers, your slow twitch muscle fibers. As exercise intensity increases, you start to use more of those fast twitch fibers in addition to your slow twitch fibers. And when you're maximally sprinting, you're using every muscle fiber at once. So you only train the fibers you've got. You're only going to get adaptations in the fibers that you train. And if someone's got loads of fast twitch fibers, then maybe they need a bit more high intensity to actually train them. Whereas if you're like me and I've got about one fast twitch muscle fiber spread across both legs, then maybe you don't need as much intensity because you don't need to train those muscle fibers. So I think it's the balance and makeup of a training program is going to be a bit different for everybody, but it's obviously going to include endurance and intensity. Like easy stuff, duration and intensity, and it's just finding a way to be sustainable.
Yeah, and maybe one of the sort of drawbacks in some of the research is that, like, if some of this is like looking at elite cyclists, but you don't become an elite cyclist unless genetically you have quite a lot of slow twitch fibers.
Yeah.
So that's there's a survivorship bias in terms of the sample that you have. And again, that's maybe going down another route of like the issues with sports science research. But yeah, there's probably not going to be anyone in that sample of 15 elite cyclists, or elite, but like junior elite cyclists that is actually has the muscular profile of like someone that should be doing a power based sport. Like they're probably predisposed to endurance sport, so then the training is gonna or if training is based on their like muscle fiber makeup, then there's probably going to be a clearer answer for them that maybe doesn't take into account now in running, like people are coming to running from things like weightlifting. Don't really want to go down the hybrid athlete avenue today, but their training for that person might differ, and that's maybe not captured all the time in the research either. I mean, I guess the clear thing that is always sort of seen is, generally more training is better, right?
I think that's what it comes down to. More is more, as long as you can sustain it. That's what I would say.
that's these, like pretty tightly controlled mechanistic studies, and it's case studies, and it's real world elite data. So something we've mentioned before is Christian Blumenfeld and that sort of training group, and they always mention that like they perform their best when they had 5 years sort of straight of training and not really any injuries. And I imagine that 5 years of consistent training improved their VO2 max, if you believe it was 100, and it improved their thresholds as well. Consistently training over a long period of time. And they probably touched on everything. They probably did some sprinting. They probably did 4x4 minute sort of type training. They probably did 4x16 type training. They probably did loads of 30-15s as well. They sort of touched everything, but kept the load high and were consistent for 5 years.
No, I think that's maybe a good place to leave it. I think one more thing I'd like to say is I do think threshold training is a really good way to train, but it's not because that's the best way to improve your thresholds in a single session. It's just that it's a sustainable way to train. You're hitting some intensity without cooking yourself, and inadvertently that means that you can accumulate a lot of work, in a single session, but also just over the course of a week, a month, a year. It's just a safer, easier, more sustainable way to accumulate high training loads. And that improves everything, like your thresholds, your economy, your VO2 max, your fat oxidation rates, your durability, like anything you want to measure. That's probably going to have the biggest impact. Are you still training? Are you still able to put out high training loads? Because the difference between one session and another, should I do 10 by 3 minutes or 6 by 5 minutes? Well, probably doesn't matter. Just need to do it for a long time. And even if there are small differences, that's not going to make a difference in the context of, did you have a week off, 2 weeks off, a month off here, there, over the course of a year because of injury, illness, etc.
I think on that point, and then sort of going back to what we were saying about that specificity trap, like just in terms of like your wider training, I was sort of thinking this the other day, and I made a note of it, that like if you think of your training as like you're cooking a meal, I think sometimes people get really stuck in the idea that like, okay, so you're training for a 5K, and therefore you need to do these really specific components of training for a 5K, which is basically just running at 5K race pace and goal race pace or whatever, like really, really, really specific. And they're sort of treating it like the meal is like you're making your dinner tonight, and like, I don't know, having sausage and mash, right? And like, so okay, so you need some sausages and you need some mash and you need some veg, and that's all you need. And then the next day the plate is completely clear and you start over again. And actually training is more like you've just always got this pot of stew going, and a session is just like a little bit of seasoning, and you just have to keep it going like all the time. And it doesn't necessarily matter exactly what you put in. But this
is an interesting analogy.
Yeah,
I'm not quite sure where you're going with it, but I think I'm following.
So you don't have to be like ridiculously specific. You just need to keep your training going, and what you've done a year ago is going to affect what's happening now. So it's not like these training for a race isn't this completely discrete bit of training that then doesn't affect 6 months time, and what you trained for 12 months ago doesn't affect what's happening now, sort of thing. It's all relative and it's all related, and you just need to keep consistently training. That's more important than like one magic session for kind of 5K in a few weeks. Like if you keep consistently training for the year, that's going to improve kind of 5K next year, even without doing 5K at goal 5K pace. I don't know. I'll work on that.
So hopefully now you all know how to improve your thresholds. We give you the exact precise sessions you need to get to improve your thresholds 1,000%.
I mean, I'm questioning myself.
And you don't need to listen to any more of our podcast episodes because you're just going to be world-class athletes. You can just crack on and do it. Or just keep running and try and do a little bit more duration, a bit more intensity. Put together week on week. That also works. But cool. Let's leave it there then. I think we're going to end up rambling soon if we haven't already. Thank you for listening, and go check out Saw. Anything else you need to say?
I think that's it for now.
Keep following our Road to Barry series.
Yep.
And hopefully you'll tune in again soon.
See you next time.